Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'm just going to briefly do some introductory stuff before we begin the talk. And today, it's just Professor Taimon Screech joining us from Tokyo and me in Cambridge, and I'll just briefly introduce him. We often, by the way, abbreviate him to Tim. So if I do that, please don't nobody be offended. I don't think he will be. Professor Taimon Screech is Professor of History of Art at SOAS and a Fellow of the British Academy. He's an expert on ukiyo-e and in general the art and culture of the Edo period. Has published a number of books, and in fact he's just published another 2 at the moment, not only this one, the Shogun Silver Telescope, which we're talking about today, but he's also published another book called Tokyo Before Tokyo. And I'm sure he really didn't need much introduction. He'll be known to most of the people at this webinar. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So thank you all for sparing the time to come. I've looked through the list of people who are attending. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends and former colleagues and future friends. So it's great. Thank you very much. So the book I've just finished has come out. I've been asked to speak to you for about 45 minutes on the subject, and you may possibly be motivated to find out more by reading the book itself. But it's a great story, and the story won't be entirely new to some of you, because as I'll come on and explain a little later on in the talk, how I came to be investigating this topic in the first place, namely the early sailings of the English East India Company to Japan, when I'm a historian of Japan, not of England. So what right have I got to be talking about this, and how did I get interested? I will come back to that. But maybe I can begin with the story itself. And it's really a very interesting one. Of course, the East India Company has a lot to answer for in its later history in terms of savagery, enslavement, expropriation, and much else. But in the early days, it was a really rather tentative and quite, what's the word? I mean, it was a querulous kind of organization. The English basically wanted to buy Asian stuff, and Europeans have wanted to do that for a very long time. Perfectly easy to do it. You went to buy it in Venice. And if you wanted to buy it cheaper than the merchants of Venice were selling it for, you went to Aleppo. And if you wanted to get even cheaper than that, you went to Istanbul. And all these things were tried and trusted and not exceptional. But obviously, if you wanted to get things cheaper than you could get them in Istanbul, you would need to go all the way to Asia. And sailings to Asia, of course, had been around for a while. The Portuguese had famously succeeded in getting to India around the Cape of Good Hope. And the English had done the same too in Drake's circumnavigation, first circumnavigation of the world by a single commander. It wasn't the first navigation because the Spanish had done it with successive commanders. But anyway, the English had sort of done it. They were confident of their maritime skills, and they were much involved with fighting the Spanish on the Spanish Main. And one thing that they would do was capture Spanish plate ships. That means ships bringing back plata, silver, to Spain. And on board these ships, they found not only Latin American mined silver, but all kinds of amazing Asian things too. Because by getting to Latin America, the Spanish had become able to reach Japan and China from the other side, not going via Africa and India, but crossing Mexico, New Spain overland and going the other way. So although Asia is an old phenomenon, it became something of particular interest to the English because of their aggression with Spain. And having captured a Spanish ship and got lots of Asian things, you realized you wanted to get more, you wanted to have control over what you're buying, you also had lots of silver with which to buy them. And so the English sail off to Java, where they will buy spices. And it seems like a long way just to go buy things to make food taste nice, but spices were also medicinal, and especially mace, which is the membrane of the nutmeg, was regarded as a cure for plague. and plague was still very common at this time. Don't forget, James I, when he came down to be King of England, was prevented from entering London for several months because of the plague. And ironically, perhaps, the head of the East India Company that sent the ship himself died of plague subsequently. So it was worth going all that way to get spices. And the English did so, and they bought them with silver. But then when peace with Spain comes, one of King James's achievements when he comes to be King of England, he concludes space, and obviously they can't blag silver from the Spaniards anymore. They can buy Spanish silver and use that to buy the spices, but that would upset the entire balance of payments. So the English have to do something else. How are they going to get their spices at a decent cost? Well, let me begin now by sharing a few images with you. And so I will probably disappear into a little corner of your screens, but more important will be to see the objects. Now, here it goes. I hope you can see. I do slideshow and start. And there you have it. So this is the kind of ship that would have gone. You can see Drake's ship. If you're in London, a replica of it is in Southwark by the bridge. But this is not exactly the same as that, but pretty similar. This is a merchantman. Later on, they'd be called East Indiaman, specifically for carrying large capacity. But of course, they also were well gunned in case of attack. And the English had been sailing with these from the foundation of the company in 1600, going on to Java. And this is a modern map. Of course, they didn't conceptualize the world in these terms. But if you can see my pointer, oops, that doesn't work. My pointer, if you want to go from Europe to the Spice Islands, which are here beyond Java, or Japan up there are only two ways to do it. You go through the states of Malacca, and that's the easiest and the best way. But the Spanish and the Portuguese were already there, and they built an enormous castle in Malacca. In fact, it was called A Famosa, the famous. It was so well known around the world, and they would not let what they called the Northern heretics through. The Northern heretics, the Dutch and the English, also wanted to trade, discovered a second way through to Asia here, which is between Sumatra and Java at Banten. So we have the two routes through, and you can buy your spices here. You can even go further on and buy them at source. Now that's what happened for the first 10 years of the East India Company's existence. It worked reasonably well. But about 1610, people start to think, let's do more than this. And they also run into the problem that they're having trouble getting silver cheap enough to buy the spices with in a commercial way. Well, people who are buying and selling in Java would, of course, have met people from all over Asia. That would have included Japanese. And some Japanese person evidently told some English person, we have no records, that must have said, why don't you come to our country? Because Japan also produces silver, so that you don't need Spanish silver, buy Japanese silver. And if you want to buy Japanese silver, well, we don't have any sheep in Japan. And England produced wool. If you want to buy something abroad as an English person in 1600, 1610, you buy it with Spanish silver until that becomes impossible. And then the only other thing you've got to trade with is woolen cloth. And so that's exactly what they do. They arrive in Java with a ship full of woolen cloth, but of course they're perfectly well aware you can't sell woolen socks and pullovers in Java where it's 35 degrees for most of the year. They do it with the intention of going up, and you can see from this map, sailing up to Japan from Java is, if you've got a pilot that can navigate through the islands, it's quite doable. You get to the Philippines. Under the treaty with the Spanish, the English agreed not to intrude into areas that the Spanish controlled. So they don't touch the Philippines. They go up to Japan because the Spanish can't claim to control Japan. The English are, as it were, entitled to attempt to trade there. So 1611, finally, 10 years after the company's been founded, they send a ship intended for Japan. They don't know whether it will actually get there. They hope it will, and indeed it does. The ship left England in a little flotilla. You wouldn't send one ship alone. That's much too risky. If it goes down, you can't save the people, you can't get news back, and obviously greater tonnage with more ships. So 4 ships left England together, and they decided if they're going to go to Japan trying new routes, try a few more new routes too. They actually went first of all to Yemen and did some trading in Yemen. And then they were intending to go to Surat, the Mughal port in the northwest of India. And in fact, they decided not to do that for various reasons. The ship goes down to Java, to Bantam, goes through that little strait on the map and goes past the Spice Islands and does some trading in the Spice Islands. They purchase a lot of spices, which they take on to Japan. And it so happens that the ship was called the Clove, right? And we don't know why they called it the Clove. Clove was a commodity they wanted to buy. But in Japanese thought, a clove is an auspicious item. And in fact, cloves are quite often the nail shape. Is often used as an ornament on Japan, signifying bounty and happiness and good fortune. And so turning up to Japan with sacks and sacks of cloves, they may have realized wasn't just about trade, it was about presenting the English as a good people. And this is the story of the telescope, really. I'll come back to it. That is the main point of today's lecture. The English want to trade, but the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch are already trading. How can the English take over a pre-existing trade? They've got to be somehow or other better. And a ship full of cloves and a ship named the Clove is just one little way in which they might have been able to make that statement. At any rate, the ship goes on, the Clove goes on under the command of an Englishman called, probably his name was John Sayers. It's the regular family name Sayers, but he spelt it S-A-R-I-S. So he's come to be known as John Saris or Saris, but we can pronounce it as we like. He was not, the name Saris doesn't exist in English, right? It's just a spelling. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll call him John Saris. He sailed the ship, or he commanded the ship successfully, and it arrived indeed in Japan. And it had on board an important present, as well as the trading commodities, the silver, the English cloth, and the spices that had been taken on in Southeast Asia. It had a gift for the ruler of Japan. It had to. The English were going to have to find a way to ingratiate themselves in a country that was already trading with the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch. And why did they need another country turning up? So the gift was not any old thing, and it was not from any old person. It was specifically sent in the name of King James. And this is quite special because the East India Company did have a government monopoly in return for no other body being allowed to import goods from beyond Guinea. So you could trade, anyone could trade as far as Guinea, which produced gold on the African coast, but nobody could trade further south and certainly couldn't go beyond the Cape unless they belonged to the East India Company. So King James had given this monopoly, but it wasn't a royal company in that sense. Nevertheless, they arrive in Japan with a gift specifically said to be in the name of the king. And I think that they did this, again, we can only speculate, is that above all, the English have to deal with the Dutch. I'll come back to the Spanish and the Portuguese in a minute, but the Dutch are ensconced and the English are on fairly good terms with the Dutch, and they're bound to be entangled with them in any process of trading themselves from the Dutch. And they needed to do this in a sort of nationalistic way, but they also need to do it because the Dutch are not stupid. Every time the Dutch committed an atrocity, which the English said they did all the time, they did it under an English flag and telling everyone that they were English. And whenever they traded legally, they put up their own flag and said that they were Dutch. So the English had this reputation all across Asia already as being brigands and thieves and hooligans and corsairs and completely untrustworthy. The Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese were already saying that because of the long wars and the Armada and all that stuff. But the Dutch also were spreading malicious rulers. So the English turn the tables. And what they do is they say, the Dutch say we are brigands and thieves. But look, we have a king. We are under an organized polity. Who doesn't have a king? The Dutch, right? Holland, of course, was a republic. And today, republics may have a good reputation, whatever your politics might be. But of course, in the 17th century, a country without a king sounded very worrying, concerning. and not least in Japan, which through the entire 16th century had no king, or you may say no effective shogun. Japan was in a state of continuous civil war throughout the entire 16th century, which had only come to an end about 1603. So that for the Japanese to suddenly be told these Dutch that you're trading with are just independent people, they have no polity, this would be something that was worrying for the Japanese to hear. So a gift in the name of King James would, no matter what the gift was, have made a significant impact. Well, often when trade happened, you would actually send a portrait of the king. That made the point clearer than anything else. And this portrait, which I'm showing you here, this is one actually from the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London. In other words, it never left the country. But identical portraits of this are all over the place. Right? There's one in Copenhagen. There's one in the Uffizi in Florence. I don't know whether anyone's ever done a survey of them, but there's a lot of them. And it was famously the case that King James hated to sit for his portrait to be taken. And so this one, which was devised quite early in the reign by John de Critz, who was the king's official painter, was reproduced again and again and again all over the place. Three-quarters view with a wearing the parliamentary robes, also, of course, an indication of England's firm governance, that this is how he looked to appear in Parliament. And in his hat, there's a very fine jewel which had stones, precious stones from the 4 countries of Britain: Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. So this was a highly political image. It wasn't just any other thing, but it seems that one was not sent to Japan. Nobody said that they didn't send one, but there's no evidence of it going. It may be the English were not sure what portraiture meant in a country so far away. Did they make portraits of kings? When much later on, the first embassy to China took a portrait of the English king, the Emperor of China received it and expressed great sorrow, sad to see that your king is dead, because in China you don't make portraits of people if they're still alive. So perhaps it was just as well the Japanese were not presented with a portrait of King James. Still, an important present went from King James to what they called the Emperor of Japan. The English were rather unclear about exactly how Japan was governed. They knew it was governed. They knew that there must be some very strong ruler, and today we know him as the Shogun. Actually, technically speaking, Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun in 1603, but he retired in 1605 in favor of his son to ensure that the succession would be handed on without being contested. So he's not technically speaking the shogun when the English arrived, but he retained supreme power, and often you can sort of think of him as the de jure rather than the de facto rather than the de jure shogun, who was his son. So John Saris and the Clove arrive into a Japanese port where the Dutch are also trading with their ship and with their present. And the local ruler says, I'm very interested to trade with you, but you'll have to wait because I have to get permission from somebody called Ange, A-N-G-E. And the English think, who is Ange? Turns out Ange was an Englishman. An was one of the Japanese words for England, short for Anglia, and Jin in Japanese means a person. So somebody called Ange, or properly speaking Japanese, Anjin, is an Englishman. And Anjin also means in Japanese a pilot. It so happened that one of the very first Dutch ship that had ever reached Japan had been piloted by an Englishman. And he had remained in Japan ever since. And it had even become quite friendly with Tokugawa Ieyasu. And so the local ruler of the port where the English arrived send word up to Ieyasu. A new country that we haven't heard of has just arrived and wants to trade. What shall I do? And Ieyasu says, I will send Anjin to meet his first time he's seen his fellow countrymen for more than a decade. And so Anjin arrives at the port and explains to Cyrus and the Englishmen about how Japan is run, that they must take an important present. The best present must go to Tokugawa Ieyasu, but they better also bring a second present appropriate to his son, who is the day Yurei Shogun. So now it's not much of a surprise, because you know, of course, what the present is. It was a silver telescope. It is probably in separate pieces, or we don't exactly know in what form it was taken to Japan, but Cyrus and Anjin, William Adams, his real name, take this to the castle where Tokugawa Ieyasu is living in retirement. It's a long way. It's in modern Shizuoka. So to do that on foot and an inland vessel would have taken a long time. Having arrived in Japan in June, Tokugawa Ieyasu is presented with his silver telescope at Sunpu Castle in Shizuoka in September. And interestingly, Cyrus presents the telescope, and then he's asked to leave. And Ieyasu remains with William Adams, Anj, for several more hours. And Cyrus goes back to his accommodation. And we don't know what they were talking about in those several hours. They knew each other very well, and they'd often spoken before. We know that Adams had even told Ieyasu that he was not Dutch. He came from a different country called England. And he told Ieyasu a little bit about what England was, that it had, for example, a king or a queen, Elizabeth I, when Adams had left. What did they talk about? Well, they must have been talking about the telescope. Ieyasu just received this extraordinary object. It was made of silver, and that's what my book title is. But actually, silver tarnishes fairly fast. So often things were made of silver and then gilt. And the English record actually refers to it as a silver gilt telescope. It would have looked more like made of gold, very stunning. And presumably Ieyasu put his eye to it and looked out of his castle tower and saw Mount Fuji. You can see Mount Fuji from that castle if the weather was clear enough. At any rate, he could have looked to the sea. He could have seen many, many things. And of course, like anyone seeing a telescope for the first time, would have been amazed and excited by what he saw. A telescope was a brand new thing at this time. Let's remember that the Clove left England in 1611. In 1610, Galileo had conducted his extraordinary discoveries. And Galileo's telescope was just a wooden thing that he used as a scientist. It obviously wasn't silver gilt. The first telescope referred to in England is also in 1609, when one was shown to King James. And he must have had an experience similar to what Ieyasu had, and decided this was a wonderful present to give to a king the other end of the world that he wanted his East India Company to trade with. We also know that a telescope was on public display in London shortly after the Clove left England. In other words, they're still very rare, very special things. Not that many people can get hold of them. Intriguingly, the one sent to Japan then was silver gilt. We can't tell what it looked like. It would be much better than the thing that Galileo used. But by chance, amazingly, I didn't even know this. Probably people who know about these things would have known. I came across it by chance. Bruegel's painting of the Five Senses, now in Madrid, includes, as you can see there, a silver telescope stuck at the feet of Cupid and the embodiment of sight. And if you look at the painting, I think the telescope is rather, it doesn't look very good just stuck there on the floor. And I think he must have added it later on, that even in 1618, a telescope is still a rather unusual thing. There's the details, sorry, it's fuzzy, but this may be how the one that went to Japan looked. The Japanese record says something the English record doesn't say, and they say that it was about, using their own measurements, about 10 feet long. So it was extremely long, and that must have meant it was actually quite powerful, possibly more powerful than the one that Galileo had used. This is 2 years later, so lenses might have improved. Galileo, of course, could see the rings of Saturn with his. The telescope then is presented, and Ieyasu and Adams have a long discussion about it and about what it means and what did it mean. Well, Galileo, of course, we all know, ran into big problems with the church, not because he discovered the rings of Saturn, which they didn't care very much about, but because he discovered that the Earth is not the center of the world. Church history, of course, early Ptolemaic astronomy teaches that the Earth is the center of the world and the sun revolves around it, which obviously you would think, standing on Earth and watching the sun move. We still say the sun rises and sets and goes behind a cloud. We use these expressions today, even though they're, of course, they're astronomically completely incorrect. So the church had a problem because the Bible quite specifically says that the sun moves, and you can't suddenly say it doesn't. Now, the church didn't care too much about this because heliocentricity was an extremely abstruse thing. Copernicus was even a Roman Catholic priest, and he did his discoveries while living with a Roman Catholic bishop in Poland. But Galileo's book was famously the book, it's been called the book that nobody ever read. If you get hold of a copy and try it, it's in Latin, it's completely impossible to understand. So so that Copernicus's discovery of heliocentricity had not really bothered anyone. The thing about a telescope is that any person using a telescope can see for themselves that heliocentricity is correct. This would give the church considerable worries, and that's why they had, it was Galileo pulled before the Inquisition. Copernicus had died peacefully in his bed. So the English have clearly turned up with an object, which is a wonderful thing to see in its own right, but which will also confuse and embarrass the Roman Catholic Church. And this is where Spain and Portugal come in. Hopefully the present given by the king will kind of neutralize the Dutch and show why the English are better than the Dutch. But the Spanish and the Portuguese had been in Japan for much longer than the Dutch had. In fact, they'd been there for decades. And most of the Spanish are buying and selling, they're merchants. But of course, there's a large number of merchants, a large number of priests, and the merchants tend to stick to the ports because that's where they have their business. But the priests wander all over the place, and the priests had had this absolute, dream of building a church in Kyoto, which was the capital city at the time. And they had exceeded in doing it. There actually was the Church of the Annunciation in Kyoto. And its bell survives, right? There it is, because the bell was such a wonderful thing. It was given to a Buddhist temple, and the Buddhist temple still has it. The church doesn't survive, but we have this one and only picture of it on a fan. And the Japanese didn't know what to call a Christian church, but -G means a temple, Nan means south, and Ban means barbarian. So the Europeans were all known as the southern barbarians because, of course, they were coming up from Java, and that meant they came from the south. They weren't thought of as being Westerners, they were thought of as being Southerners. So the Nambanji actually wasn't too rude to call them Namban. Nambanji is what churches got called. Of course, the missionaries, mostly Jesuits, but also Franciscans and Dominicans, they were seeking conversions. But in order to appeal to the Japanese, most Japanese didn't even understand what you mean. Japanese doesn't make a distinction between singular or plural, right? So how you can explain the importance of a monotheism is quite difficult. It doesn't matter to a Japanese person whether there's one God or 4 or 10 or 50. And it'd never be an issue. And suddenly people are coming up and saying there's only one God and all the rest are fake. And it doesn't get through to people very easily. But the Jesuits also taught in Japan astronomy. And this was absolutely crucial because various Japanese rituals surrounding the court and the protection of not the shogun, but the actual emperor of Japan, this kind of priestly figure living in Kyoto at this point. It's very important to predict eclipses. This is really key to Japanese political thinking. And over the course of a lunar calendar that went out of sync, Japanese astronomers had become less and less able to predict eclipses, and the Jesuits could do it. This is also a reason why the Christian missions were accepted in China, not to teach the gospel, but to teach astronomy. And this is why they were accepted. And the English had suddenly turned up, and they say to the Japanese, all that astronomy they've been teaching you for the last 50 years, telling you how important it is, it's wrong. It's not only wrong, they know it's wrong, and they're teaching you lies. And this must have been what Ieyasu heard in those hours after Cyrus has left the room, while he has in his hands his silver telescope. Well, Cyrus was given, as a result of this, permission to open a trading station in Japan. And Ieyasu even said, you can trade anywhere in my dominions that you wish. In fact, if you're coming up from Java, then you're going to be in the south of Japan, round about Nagasaki, which is where all the Western ships were coming in. So they didn't try to dock anywhere else. But the English opened a trading station. Sorry, again, the slide is rather poor. But on the right-hand side, this is in a Dutch collection today. This is the port of Hirado, very near to Nagasaki, where the English set up. Can you see in the middle there? There is this little English house with a George Cross, which I've given you a detail on the left. That is where they established themselves, and the Dutch were not very far away. And although they're, of course, they're intense rivals and they're trying to badmouth each other to the Japanese all the time, so far away, the English and the Dutch actually spent lots of time getting drunk with each other and having parties. And they also kabuki, right? Kabuki now is a very fine theatrical form, but in its early days, kabuki was basically women coming around to do erotic dances after dinner, and the English and the Dutch are always having kabuki parties at which women turn up. Of course, the English and Dutch are only men. There are no women except the local girlfriends that they have. Anyway, a certain amount of conviviality, and the local ruler of this area was perfectly happy to see that going on. Armed, anyway, they create this trading station, which is called, technically speaking, a factory, not a manufactory where you make things, but a factory where you sell things. And from Tokugawa Ieyasu, they are given this splendid, of course, to the English unreadable, permission to trade. And in Japanese, these are called shúinjo. It means Vermillion Seal documents. And there it is, that massive seal in the corner, which nobody would dare to countermand something that has the Shogun's imprimatur on it. And this was brought back. And when it came back to England, this is a little side story, but I'll tell you very quickly. When it came back to England, of course, people could see this was an amazingly important document, but nobody could read it. And so they thought, well, no, what should we do with it? Technically speaking, it's a response to King James. So it was not the company's property. So they probably asked the king, what the hell should we do with it? But there wasn't really a royal library. And so they think, what should we do? Well, the head of the East India Company was not a university man, but the deputy head of the East India Company, whose name was Maurice Abbott, it so happened that his brother was the professor of divinity at Oxford. And while the Clove was sailing off to Japan, he had actually been promoted to Archbishop of Canterbury. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, Maurice Abbott is the brother. George Abbott is the priest, the bishop. He suggests they send it down to Oxford, and the Bodleian Library in Oxford University was brand new at this time. It had only just been opened, so the appropriate place, and it still sits today in the Bodleian Library. Occasionally, it's displayed. Cyrus sailed back to England at the end of 1613, right? If you remember, he'd left England 1611, he arrived in Japan 1613 summer, he presented in September, and he left. Within months, actually within weeks, even possibly within days of Cyrus leaving, Ieyasu issues an instruction. All Jesuit churches must be torn down. All priests must leave the country. And there was a tremendous destruction. And in the early months of 1614, running through into the autumn, there's what's often known as the Great Exile. A vast number of Japanese Christians fled, and mostly they went to Manila, of course, under Spanish protection, or they went to Goa in India under Portuguese protection. We don't know the numbers involved, probably in the thousands, and good 50 or 60 priests and friars left too. A large number of Japanese people who'd been converted only because their lord had told them to convert, and the lord had only told them to convert because he wanted to buy guns from the Spanish and the Portuguese. Well, they just reverted to being Buddhists again. Many people weren't even very clear that being Christian wasn't just another kind of Buddhism anyway. Whatever happens, that there's a beginning of a mass de-Christianization of Japan in the winter of 1613-14. And people have always recognized this. The Great Exile is an important moment in Japanese history, and many learned Jesuit scholars over the years have, but what nobody's ever really said, and I honestly think I might be able to say I'm the first one that thought of this, is that why did it happen then? The Portuguese and the Spanish have been around in Japan for 50 years. Suddenly, in one winter, they're told to leave and the churches are torn down. It can only be because the English turned up with their telescope. Well, that's the story, really, and you'll have to read the book to hear more. But let me very quickly finish. I've got just a couple of minutes before I should stop. People have said, so where is the telescope then? The King of Spain, about this time, gave Tokugawa Ieyasu a clock, a beautiful clock, and it still sits in Japan because when Ieyasu died, in 1616, shortly after this, most of his worldly possessions were donated to his mausoleum, where they still are. And that clock given by the King of Spain is actually the oldest working clock in existence with a dial. There are older clocks which are just kind of pendulum things, right? So this telescope ought to still be there in the mausoleum. And if it was there, it would be the oldest telescope in existence, because Galileo's one, of course, all these early ones are long since gone. Well, I've had many wonderful evenings with the abbot of the Shogun's mausoleum. He's a very wonderful person to go out with, full of knowledge, but he tells me he searched high and low and there is no telescope left. It must have been lost before Ieyasu died, and possibly he took it on a campaign because, of course, telescopes have a lot of field value in a campaign, right? To look at the castle they're trying to bomb, or to see if enemy troops are coming. So this is perfectly possible. It came to a sad end, but it had kind of done the trick, if the trick was to not just embarrass the Spanish and the Portuguese, but actually have the priests expelled. Anyway, since the telescope does not exist, and it was given in 1613, when 2013 came around, which is already 7 years ago, we decided, some of us, to organize a new telescope to be given in its place. And I was a co-chair of a group called Japan 400 that Jason James was part of this. Nicholas McLean was co-chair. Nicholas is with us this evening, so I'm glad he could join it. And many of you who are attending tonight, of course, were aware of Japan 400 and were part of it in 2013 to 2014. So 2014, we were able to secure the production of a brand new British English-made telescope, entirely made in England, or actually in Wales, I beg your pardon, but made in Britain. And it doesn't look like the one Ieyasu produced. How could it have been? But it was taken out to Japan to celebrate the 400th anniversary, and it made a big impact in Japan, and it was shown at the British Embassy. And I'm glad the British ambassador from that period, Sir Tim Hitchens, is also able to join us today. So I thank him again for displaying that. And the Crown Prince turned up to view it. And unfortunately, we were forbidden to take a photograph of the Crown Prince. So I can't show him standing in front of it. But he was there, I promise you. And of course, that Crown Prince is now the Emperor of Japan. And I'm assured that he holds in fond memory this event of seeing the telescope. But it couldn't stay in the embassy forever, and it wouldn't be seen by that many people if it was. So what we decided to do was send it to Sunpu Castle. You just saw the slide of it. Much of the castle was reconstructed in modern times, but it's reconstructed entirely authentically, using original plans and using original technology. And so it was installed there, And excuse the self-publicity, but there I am in Sunpu Castle with the telescope. And it's available to be seen if you go. It's a proud feature of the castle display. School children and of course any tourist that goes to the castle will see it. And this year, obviously, very few visitors, but it was up to the 25,000 or people every year were passing through, and they would have been informed of the history of English trade with Japan, which is a history that has not been told very much because, and this is my final point, moving wool from London to Japan is never going to work because it will rot on board ship along the way. The East India Company had always intended that they would sail to Japan back and forth over the top of Russia. We know it can't be done. It can't be done for two reasons. Firstly, because the seas are permanently frozen. But secondly, because they had no knowledge of Siberia. Even without frozen seas, sailing over the top of Russia and over the top of Siberia is actually not much faster than sailing all the way around Africa and India. But during the process of the East India Company's existence in Japan, they are biding their time, holding the fort, as it were, until the first ship will arrive in Japan from Archangel and then over the top of Russia. And indeed, while Cyrus is in Japan and the English that remain in Japan are investigating a passageway back to England that way. And eventually they realize it's not going to work. And eventually, in 1623, exactly one decade after they've established themselves in England, in Japan, and given the telescope, the English admit defeat, and they pull out of Japan, and they concentrate on their other trades in various areas. And obviously, you know the story. They put all their efforts into India, and that's another story. But when they leave Japan, they don't entirely give up. 1623, they say, we're leaving temporarily. And the local ruler down on the port of Hirado is asked to look after some of their stuff. And some of their stuff is wool, of course. It's not going to last. But the other thing the English have begun exporting to Japan is Delftware, ceramics. You may think that's ridiculous because Japanese make beautiful porcelain, but the Japanese did not make beautiful porcelain in 1613. It came later. So in fact, perversely enough, English ceramics may have been better than Japanese ceramics at this time. But the English ceramics were made right around the corner from where I live in Southwark. So I love this part of the story. That next time you're wandering around Southwark, if you ever do, go to Montague Court, which is right in the lee of Southwark Cathedral. And that was what they called a pothouse. It was one of London's first ceramic makers, and this was all sent to Japan. So anyway, the local warlord has a pile of English pots to look after. They say, we'll be back before very long. Before they come back, the Shogun died, not Ieyasu, who's already dead, but the actual Yurei Shogun died. And when his grave was blown apart by a bomb in the Second World War, what should they find buried with him but English ceramics? He must have liked them enough that he took them to the grave with him. Still, the English don't come back, and they don't come back, and then there's a civil war in England, and they don't come back, and eventually they arrive back in Japan exactly 50 years after they left in 1673. And the Japanese say, what kept you? We've been waiting. Love to trade with you again. The Dutch, who at this point have monopolized trade, are not so happy. And so they tell the Japanese, the Queen of England is Portuguese. She's a Roman Catholic, which is true, Catherine of Braganza. And so the Japanese say, I'm sorry, because we've expelled the Spanish and Portuguese. We don't have any missionaries anymore. We can't trade with you if the Queen is Portuguese. So the English say, well, can we come back when she's dead? And the Japanese say, yes. But the dowry of Catherine of Braganza was Bombay. And that's why the English then put all their efforts into Japan, into India, and they kind of forget about Japan. And that, sadly enough, is the end of the story. So thank you very much for listening. I think I've gone 1 minute over time. I hope I haven't bored you too much, and I look forward to your questions.
So, Tim, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to reading the book, which I haven't managed to yet. And goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for listening. Bye.